While Costello spent the next 3 days checking off Hopkinsville, Bowling Green, and Elizabethtown, Avery and Candace continued their tea parties. Avery kept watching his location as he pedaled through Kentucky. She was becoming quite the long-distance pit crew. Candace was getting the updates in real time as he seemed to be improving his pace dramatically. Before he reached West Virginia, Avery told Candace he'd mentioned he wants to come up to Ojai and see the piano. Candace lit up with joy. She asked how many days were estimated before they would fly out to Maine. She wanted to get back home and see that she has it ready for him. Avery appeared to not even hear Candace. She was fixated on Claire. Candace gave a good chuckle and told Avery she had nothing to worry about. Claire was one of Costello's friends from the ether. Candace went on to tell Avery she was quite fond of Claire and held her close to her heart. She has always assumed it was who Costello sought out whenever he was lost or confused by his father's behavior towards him. "Are you familiar with the sacred feminine, Avery?" Candace asked. "Of course," she responded. Costello was in tune with this long before anyone would have ever needed to teach him. He refused to suppress his feminine energy, and Claire was the totem in his world who helped him always hold this feminine energy. Candace went on to explain how Costello could describe her in great detail. She was the Rembrandt, his museum of collections. The men were always sadly abstract or void. The vacuum rarely became empty. However, when it did, he was a very lost boy. It was extremely difficult to soothe the sadness at times. Candace wept in front of Avery for once. She began to remember each and every time she could have done more to bring him joy. She sees now why she has been drawn to him again. "Avery, please don't hurt him," Candace said politely. "Never," Avery said as she embraced her. They began to cobble together their own itinerary. According to Avery's timeline, they have about a week to have Candace back to Ojai to prepare the piano and pack to return to Los Angeles. Candace took care of the planning and the costs for their trip to Maine and New Hampshire. All Avery had to do was provide her real ID and make sure she had the time off from work. Then they're off to New Hampshire for a quick visit, and then Maine the day after Costello finishes the tour. Wednesday, September 26, 2024. He was in his best cycling shape. It was almost as though he hadn't already pedaled just over 2,000 miles. He felt like all the adversity was in the rear view, building his tolerance to the mushrooms, strengthening his core and extremities to be cycling at such a high level, and getting through the triggers about the Seattle murders were all checked off. He no longer needed to wonder what buried psychoanalysis would surface through West Virginia. He was looking forward to the trip across his hometown and the few miles after crossing the border into Maine. In fact, he was so focused on cycling, he had no idea another wave of the SARS-CoV-2 virus had yet again mutated and scattered another variant nationwide. Some people were taking precautions with masks and distancing for the good of others, while the same group of naysayers were out protesting the announcement of this new variant. The division had become intolerable. Most of West Virginia went unmasked, so those who Costello encountered at his checkpoints looked status quo. Even Candace and Avery were so numb to the naysayers, they didn't open up much about their contrary beliefs, and nothing was passed along to Costello. He was still wearing a face covering in strange crowded settings, so he was protecting others, even when he was unaware of spikes and infections. He still wore the face covering out of habit from the years of gripping it like a cudgel for his agoraphobia, but in the end, it was a great way for him to be one of the few who helped contain the spread. In nearly 5 years, he hadn't once tested positive, but he knew if he were ever asymptomatic, his responsibility to his brothers and sisters was to keep the illness to himself. Creeping into multiple weeks of experiencing Middle America gave Costello his new sense of kinship with many unknowns. He was meeting new people who were fascinated with this trek across the country. These were folks he couldn't see himself sharing a drink with back in Los Angeles. However, being in their backyards lightened the air around him. Knowing damn well he and many of these folks didn't share even a single belief, he found a way with his words, and before long, he was chumming it up with Texans, Oklahomans, Kentuckians, and West Virginians. There was a sudden added excitement to his upcoming time in New Hampshire. Now having the ability to share his experiences with these antagonists his life has shaped him to believe were not his friends. Sure, many of them wouldn't piss on him if he were ablaze in a diner based on his liberal beliefs, and there was sadly no change in their minds. However, he was finally able to see how others fall victim to their environment and culture, while never understanding how undertows of their core values can be hurtful to the people with whom they share a community. The landscapes were spectacular, and that was what drew Costello to searching for a way to bind the American understanding back together. If only we could all understand the history and atone for how our ancestors chose to find freedom from religion, so they could seek their faith without order, acknowledge the centuries of inequities and evolve towards a shared space with unity and penance, amalgamate for the sake of peace and prosperity. Maybe we could finally share these wonderful landscapes without judgment and dissension. Costello knew it wasn't one side that needed to make this commitment. Sure, there have been many more faces of evil in one group, but it doesn't take away the responsibility of each group to find the intersection where all of this would be possible. The next 4 days were yet again another pivot from the original plan. Instead of pushing himself and making it in 3 days, Costello chose to add a day and drop his pace. He scorched through Kentucky and found so much solace. He wanted to put Avery and Mom aside for a few more days and see more states. The only mental drift he experienced in Kentucky was Grans. Grans told Costello about the Kentucky Derby every year. He wanted to travel just once to be there for the greatest horse race on earth. Costello watched as the landscapes whipped by him, knowing he was right there where Grans would have lived out one of his dreams. Sadly, he was not only miles from the track, but not even close to race day. He considered a picture at the venue, but who would have really understood the retrospection other than Costello? He really did hate having to explain things like this to people. Costello popped up into Pennsylvania and then into Jersey. He needed to start smelling and feeling the ocean again. This allowed him to pedal up through New York, Connecticut, Mass, and finally land in New Hampshire. Home sweet home. After all the southern hospitality and very quaint mountain folks through Kentucky and West Virginia, he was ready to mix with that demographic he'd been surrounded by as a child, though never truly got to experience. The idea of adding the 4 extra states, especially these 4, was rather incentivizing. Costello started to see New Hampshire as his swan song before touching down on Maine and finally sitting down for a couple of real celebratory drinks. Philly, Jersey, and New York offered up great historic bars and vibrant people. He was able to just relax and let them all present themselves. His night in Jersey wound up a doozy. He forgot he'd already dosed himself and took a second dose after lunch. His evening on the shore was a bit more vibrant than the local crowd even brought to the table. The difference was, in the southern and mountain states, he was so inquisitive. He observed the behaviors and personalities he was diametrically opposed to, though he understood the locations and ethos created the charm that was brutally honest. In Jersey, he found the charisma of these wild ones came off as more of a facade. Their allure was still very captivating and rather fun. He got a little misty-eyed when he left for New York, where he was instantly abstinent from nearly everything. Costello met his match here. There was no deep diving into psyches. He'd find himself lonely in a dumpster if he tried to get all Katie Couric with them. He acquiesced and just had a great time sharing stories and drinking seltzer. He wanted to blast through Connecticut without even the slightest hangover, so not even a sip of booze. Great thing was, nobody even second-guessed him. They minded their business, and he minded his. Even better, he exchanged numbers with 2 cyclists he met, and they made plans for him to return to New York. When he kicked off into Connecticut, Avery texted him and asked if he could take a call. Not the best plan, since he intended on getting through quickly and uninterrupted. She hit him with bad news. Very bad news. The airline contacted her after a pre-COVID screening and told her a rapid test came back positive. She would need a PCR test with a negative result in order to fly. Her test was scheduled for Monday and could take 48 hours for results. Costello was so out of touch, he wasn't aware airlines were conducting rapid tests within 1 week of flying and then again the day of the flight. Even with the vaccination and face covering, it was becoming clear the absolute best way to eliminate any infections was to make sure everyone on board provided a negative test. Twice. Even with the waves of new mutations, the testing was still not as quick as everyone would like. Costello was in trouble with the timeline. He knew he could crush Connecticut in 6 hours and Massachusetts in 8. Though Massachusetts would most certainly require a pub stop for more seltzer water and maybe, just maybe, a bartender suggestion. This is when it really dawned on him. It's Sunday, September 30th, 2024, and he is so sheltered from COVID, he truly assumed this would all be fine. The thought of her not coming wasn't an option. After altering all her hard work on the itinerary and ghosting her for way more days than he intended, he needed to see her come to Maine. He needed to honor her for her commitment to his tour and the wherewithal to still be right there even after not staying in touch way more than he planned. He wanted to offer up a statement on the fly and thank her for everything. Then he realized that would send very poor energy into the universe. Best to play it cool and clearly stay committed to her coming. Essentially saying she's going to test negative and there would be nothing rotten in Denmark. Tuesday, October 2nd, 2024. Another 2 days in the dark with Avery and Candace. He finally made it to New Hampshire. He stopped in Greenfield in northern Massachusetts, found a quiet little bar. Not the best looking place he's seen, but isn't that what bar hopping on a cycling tour is about? He immediately asked about a signature Massachusetts drink. The bartenders laughed and said at their bar, he could get a canned vodka soda or a watered down cocktail. He explained he's pedaled from Los Angeles and was hoping for something to tell people about back home. One of the bartenders stepped in and said they weren't in Boston, but could make a signature Boston cocktail. Costello said as an alumni bartender he was honored, and minutes later they pushed over Award 8. As he watched the rye whiskey come out with a variety of juices, maraschino cherries and grenadine, he became very curious. Was it a spin on an old-fashioned or a Manhattan? Until the shaker came out. Digging back into his history, he remembered plenty of drinks being shaken. However, these ingredients were in his memory to be stirred. Turns out this cocktail was rooted in the old whiskey sour. After this bartender stopped shaking and began to pour the drink, he gave Costello a brief history on the drink itself. The Ward 8 was named after a geographical location in the West End of Boston. In the late 1800s, a Democratic political czar with his sights set on winning a seat in the state's legislature was quite powerful, and the drink was created in his honor. No details on ingredients or spirit preference, but he would garner huge support from constituents in Ward 8, so the name was the draw. Ironically, this politician was a prohibitionist, so odds are he never even wet his lips with this cocktail. More proof politicians will fake anything if it will get them the votes.